The rain battered the city street, a relentless curtain of water that turned the world into a blur of grey and shadow. As Michael trudged home from his night shift at the community center, his janitor's uniform heavy with dampness, his boots splashed through shallow puddles, each step driven by the thought of his 7-year-old daughter, Ellie, tucked into bed under the watchful care of their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, whose warm tamales were probably still sitting in his fridge. Under a flickering street lamp, he spotted a figure, a young woman, drenched, her dark hair clinging to her pale cheeks like wet ink, her posture rigid yet trembling. Michael's first instinct was to keep moving. He had Ellie to think of, a life built on caution and routine, but something in the way she stood, alone and defiant against the storm, pulled at him. "You shouldn't be out here," he called, his voice low but clear, cutting through the rain's steady hiss. The woman, Sarah, whipped round, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and stubborn pride, her arms crossed tightly as if shielding herself from more than the cold. "I don't need your pity," she snapped, but her voice cracked, and her gaze flickered nervously toward the dark alley behind her. Michael stopped a few feet away, his reflective vest catching the dim light. "Not pity," he said gently, "just a dry place to wait out the night. It's not safe here at 2 a.m. Her lips parted, ready to argue, but the wind gusted, and she shivered, her thin jacket no match for the chill. He noticed her hands, knuckles white, shaking not just from the cold, but from something raw, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. "What happened?" he asked, softer now, his eyes catching hers. Sarah looked away, her breath hitching. "Mugged, phone's gone, bag's gone, everything's gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if admitting it made the loss real. Michael's chest tightened. He thought of Ellie, of how he'd hoped someone would stop for her in a moment like this, and that thought drowned out his caution. "I live 2 blocks away," he said, shifting his worn work bag. "It's small, but it's warm. Couch is yours till morning." Sarah's eyes searched his face, looking for a catch, but found only quiet sincerity. She hesitated, pride warring with desperation, then nodded faintly, her shoulders slumping as she gave in. Michael keeping a careful distance, his eyes scanning the empty street for any sign of trouble, while Sarah followed, her steps uneven, her sneakers squelching with each stride. The apartment building loomed ahead, its faded brick and chipped paint. Michael unlocked the door, holding it open for her, and the faint warmth of the hallway greeted them, carrying the scent of laundry detergent and something faintly sweet, like Ellie's fruit snacks. "Shoes off here," he said, pointing to a worn mat by the door. "Couches in the living room. There's a blanket in the closet." Sarah stepped inside, her eyes catching on a small pair of rain boots by the wall, bright yellow with ladybug stickers, and a corkboard covered in childish drawings of stars and cats. The space was lived in, cluttered with signs of a life centered around a child, and it made her pause, her fingers tightening around her soaked jacket. Michael handed her a clean towel and a faded grey sweatshirt, its sleeves slightly frayed, but soft. "Bathrooms down the hall. Water's slow to heat up, but it works," he said, his voice steady, practiced, like he'd offered comfort to someone small and scared 1,000 times. Sarah took the items, her hands brushing his forehead. Moment, and she noticed the calluses on his fingers, the kind earned from years of hard work. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp, searching for his motive. Michael rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes meeting hers with a disarming honesty. "Because I'd want someone to do it for my daughter, if she was ever out. They're like you are," he said, and the words landed softly, like a promise. Sarah's throat tightened, unaccustomed to kindness without strings, and she managed a small nod before he turned to check on Ellie. He moved to a back room, pausing to lock his wallet in a drawer, not out of distrust, but from a habit born of necessity. Returning, he placed a mug of warm water on the coffee table, next to a folded blanket and a note that read, "Phone's on the wall if you need it. Extra blankets in the closet. Please keep the door closed. Ellie's a light sleeper." Sarah stared at the note, her fingers grazing the mug's warmth, and something inside her shifted, a flicker of safety she hadn't felt in days. She sank onto the couch, pulling the blanket over her, the rain's soft patter outside, lulling her into a fragile calm, as if this stranger's small act of trust had opened a door she hadn't known she needed. Sarah stirred on the couch, the faint scent of coffee and crayons pulling her from a dreamless sleep, her body stiff from the night's ordeal but warmed by the soft blanket draped over her. The apartment was quiet, save for the gentle hum of a radiator and the distant clink of dishes from what must be the kitchen. Sunlight filtered through a thin curtain, casting a golden glow across the room, illuminating a small shelf cluttered with children's books, and a single framed photo of Michael and a little girl with curly hair, both grinning at a park. Sarah's eyes lingered on the photo, a pang of something unfamiliar, maybe, or longing tugging at her chest. She sat up, the oversized sweatshirt Michael had given her slipping off one shoulder, and noticed the mug of water, now cool, still sitting on the coffee table beside his note. Its simple kindness, written in neat, unhurried script, made her pause, her fingers tracing the paper's edge as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet formed. The sound of a child's giggle broke her thoughts, high and carefree, coming from the back of the apartment. Sarah stood, hesitant, and padded barefoot toward the noise, her wet clothes from last night folded neatly on a chair, another small gesture she hadn't expected. In the narrow hallway, she passed a tiny pair of sneakers with faded stickers, and the sight made her smile despite herself. The kitchen door was ajar, and she peeked inside to see Michael at the stove, his broad back to her, stirring something in a pan while a little girl Ellie, she assumed, sat on a stool, swinging her legs and chattering about a cartoon dog. "He's got a cape, Daddy, but he doesn't fly. He just runs really fast," Ellie said, her voice bright as she colored a piece of paper with a purple crayon. Michael chuckled, low and warm, and Sarah felt an ache at the sound, like stumbling on a memory she didn't own. She cleared her throat softly, and Ellie's head whipped around, her brown eyes wide with curiosity. "You're awake," Ellie exclaimed, hopping off the stool and bouncing toward Sarah, her curls bouncing with her. "Daddy said you got rained on, like a lost kitten, so he gave you a blanket." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the girl's warmth, and managed a small laugh. "I guess I was pretty soggy," she said, her voice rough from sleep. Michael turned, a spatula in hand, his face softening as he saw her. "Morning," he said, nodding toward a chair. "Coffee's fresh if you want some. Breakfast is almost ready." Sarah hesitated, feeling like an intruder in this intimate scene, but Ellie tugged at her hand, pulling her toward the table. "Sit with me, I'll show you my dog picture," Ellie said, shoving a drawing of a lopsided puppy toward her. Sarah sat, her guard lowering as Ellie rambled about the dog's imaginary adventures, and she found herself nodding, even smiling, at the girl's enthusiasm. Michael set a plate of pancakes in front of them, slightly lopsided but golden, and poured coffee into a chipped mug for Sarah. "Hope you like them plain. We're out of syrup," he said, a hint of apology in his tone. Sarah shook her head, wrapping her hands round the mug, its warmth seeping into her palms. "This is more than enough," she said, and meant it, the simple act of being included in their morning routine stirring something deep within her. They ate together, Ellie filling the silence with stories while Michael listened, his quiet presence anchoring the room. Sarah stole glances at him, noting the way his eyes crinkled when Ellie laughed, the way he cut her pancakes into tiny squares, without being asked. When Ellie spilled juice on the table, Sarah instinctively reached for a napkin, and Michael's hand brushed hers as he did the same, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment. "Sorry," he murmured, but his smile was kind, unhurried, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm. After breakfast, Ellie ran to grab her coloring book, leaving them alone. Michael leaned back, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "You sleep okay?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes searching. Sarah nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Better than I have in a while," she admitted, then hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Thank you for last night. I didn't expect," she trailed off, unsure how to finish. Michael shrugged, but his gaze was steady. "Didn't seem right to leave you out there," he said simply. Sarah bit her lip, wanting to say more, to explain the mess of her life, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she asked, "How do you do it? All of it, alone?" Michael's expression softened, and he glanced toward the hallway where Ellie's laughter echoed. "You just do." "For her," he said, his voice low, carrying a weight that made Sarah's heart ache. He stood, clearing the plates, then paused. "There's a diner down the street. My friend Rosa runs it. They're always short-handed. If you're looking to stay in town a bit, I could ask her about a job." Sarah's breath caught, the offer unexpected yet tempting, a chance to pause her running. She nodded slowly. "I'd like that," she said, surprised by her own certainty. Michael gave a small nod, as if sealing a quiet pact, and Sarah felt something shift, a fragile trust, taking root in the warmth of this small, cluttered kitchen. Sarah stepped into the diner's chaos, the air thick with the scent of frying bacon and brewed coffee, the clatter of plates and shouted orders jarring after the quiet warmth of Michael's kitchen. Her borrowed sneakers, still stiff from newness, squeaked on the checkered floor as Rosa, the diner's no-nonsense owner, tossed her an apron with a brisk "You're on dishes, don't break anything." Sarah nodded, her stomach knotting with nerves, her hands still raw from the previous night's cold. She hadn't worked a job like this before, not with her life of tailored schedules and expectations, but the idea of earning something honest felt like a lifeline. The morning blurred into a frenzy of scrubbing pots, stacking plates, and dodging waitresses who barked orders like drill sergeants. Her back ached, her fingers pruned from soapy water, but there was a strange satisfaction in the rhythm of it, in the tangible proof of her effort piling up in clean stacks. During a rare lull, Rosa slid a plate of fries across the counter, her sharp eyes softening. "Eat, kid, you look like you're running on fumes," she said, and Sarah managed a grateful smile, the salty warmth of the fries grounding her. By noon, Ellie burst through the diner's door, her school backpack bouncing, Michael trailing behind with a tired but fond smile. "Sarah," Ellie called, waving a drawing of a lopsided sun, her enthusiasm cutting through the diner's din like a beam of light. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, crouching to admire the artwork, her heart lifting at Ellie's unfiltered joy. "This is for you. It's a happy sun because you're not rainy anymore," Ellie said, and Sarah's throat tightened, the child's words touching a place she'd kept guarded. Michael leaned against the counter, his work boots scuffed but his posture relaxed, watching them with a quiet pride. "She insisted on coming straight here after school," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic, but his eyes held a warmth that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She stood, brushing her hands nervously on her jeans, and offered to help Ellie with her coloring while Michael grabbed a coffee. They sat in a corner booth, Ellie chattering about her day, her small fingers guiding Sarah's to shade in a cloud. The simple act of coloring together, of being trusted by this bright, open-hearted girl, felt like a gift Sarah hadn't earned. Michael watched from the counter, his gaze lingering on Sarah's hesitant smile, and for a moment she caught him looking, their eyes locking in a way that felt like a conversation without words. The diner's bustle faded, and she saw something. In his expression, curiosity, maybe, or recognition of the same quiet strength she was starting to see in herself. When Ellie ran to the jukebox to pick a song, Michael slid into the booth, his calloused hands resting on the table. "You're doing all right here," he said, not a question but a statement, his tone carrying a respect that made Sarah sit a little straighter. "It's harder than I thought," she admitted, glancing at her reddened hands, "but it feels real." He nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes, and she wondered what struggles he'd faced to carry that look. The conversation turned to Ellie, to her love of stories and her habit of sneaking extra cookies, and Sarah found herself laughing, the sound surprising her with its ease. As the afternoon waned, Rosa called Sarah back to work, but not before Michael slipped her a small paper bag. "For later," he said, his voice casual but his eyes steady. Inside was a sandwich, wrapped carefully, a small gesture that felt like an extension of the trust he'd offered the night before. Sarah tucked it into her pocket, her fingers brushing the fabric, and felt a spark of determination to stay, to prove she could belong in this world of hard work and small kindnesses. When her shift ended, she walked back to Michael's apartment. With him and Ellie, the evening air cool against her flushed cheeks, Ellie skipped ahead, singing a made-up song about stars, and Michael fell into step beside Sarah, their silence comfortable but charged with unspoken questions. At the apartment, Ellie begged Sarah to read her a bedtime story, and Sarah, hesitant but drawn in by the girl's pleading eyes, sat on the edge of Ellie's bed, reading about a brave rabbit in a tattered book. Michael leaned in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching with a softness that made Sarah's heart ache. When Ellie drifted off, her small hand still clutching Sarah's, Michael whispered, "You're good with her," and Sarah felt a warmth spread through her, like she'd found a place she hadn't known she was searching for. As she stepped back into the living room, the weight of her old life, its secrets, its pressures loomed in the back of her mind, but for now, she let it stay there, overshadowed by the glow of this small, imperfect home. Sarah's hands ached as she stacked plates in the diner's steamy kitchen, the clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation blending into a familiar rhythm after a week of long shifts. The work was grueling, her arms sore from lifting heavy trays, but there was a quiet pride in the calluses forming on her palms, proof of a life she was building from scratch. She'd settled into a routine, spending evenings with Michael and Ellie, their small apartment becoming a refuge where laughter and Ellie's endless stories about school softened the edges of her exhaustion. That afternoon, as she wiped down a counter, her duffel bag sat tucked behind a crate of glassware, its contents untouched since she'd arrived. Reaching for a rag, she nudged the bag, and a soft clink made her freeze. Her heart thudded as she unzipped it, revealing a delicate gold necklace with a sapphire pendant, its deep blue catching the diner's fluorescent light like a secret she'd meant to bury. It was a relic from her old life, a gift from her father meant to bind her to his world, and she'd hidden it, hoping to forget its weight. Before she could shove it back, Michael walked in, carrying a tray of dirty dishes, his sleeves rolled up from helping bus tables. His eyes landed on the necklace, and he paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's not something you pick up at a thrift store," he said, his voice quiet but pointed, not accusing but searching. Sarah's fingers closed around the pendant, her pulse racing as she stuffed it into her pocket. "It's nothing, just something I forgot I had," she said, her words too quick, her eyes avoiding his. Michael set the tray down, his movements deliberate, and leaned against the counter, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Sarah, who are you running from?" he asked, his tone soft but firm, like he was offering her a chance to let go of the weight she carried. She swallowed, her throat tight, the truth clawing its way up. "I walked away from a life where everything was decided for me," she said finally, her voice low, "a family that saw me as a piece on a board, not a person." She didn't mention her father's wealth, the sprawling estate, or the marriage he'd arranged to secure a business deal, but the words felt like a crack in her armor. Michael nodded, his expression unreadable, but he didn't press further, and that restraint made her chest ache with gratitude. He turned back to the dishes, but the air between them felt heavier, like a door had opened but not fully swung wide. Later, as they walked home with Ellie skipping ahead, her backpack bouncing, Sarah felt the necklace in her pocket like a stone. Ellie tugged at her hand, asking her to join in a game of counting streetlights, and Sarah obliged, her laughter mingling with Ellie's giggles. But her mind lingered on Michael's question. At the apartment, while Ellie colored at the kitchen table, Sarah helped Michael with dinner, chopping vegetables with a clumsiness that made him smile. "You're getting better," he teased, nudging her elbow, and she felt a warmth at his ease, his ability to let the moment pass without judgment. But as they sat down to eat, Ellie's chatter filling the room, Sarah caught Michael watching her, his eyes holding a quiet curiosity, and she wondered how long she could keep her past buried. The next day at the diner, as she folded napkins, during a slow hour, the bell above the door jingled, and a man in a dark jacket stepped in, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto her. Her stomach dropped as he pulled out a phone, snapping a quick photo before she could turn away. "Found you," he muttered, his voice smug, and Sarah's hands froze, the napkin slipping to the floor. Michael, wiping down a nearby table, caught the shift in her posture and was at her side in an instant. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low, his body subtly positioning itself between her and the man. The stranger smirked, holding up his phone. "Her father's been looking for her, offering a nice reward for anyone who knows where she's hiding," he said, snapping another photo. Sarah's breath hitched, panic rising like a tide, but Michael's hand grazed her arm, steadying her. "You need to leave," he told the man, his voice calm but edged with steel. The stranger shrugged, pocketing his phone, but not before Michael stepped closer, his presence a quiet threat. The man left, but the weight of his words lingered, and Sarah felt her carefully built world teetering. She turned to Michael, her eyes wide with fear. "I didn't want you to get pulled into this," she whispered, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "You're not pulling me into anything. I'm already here," he said, and the conviction in his voice made her heart stutter. They finished the shift in tense silence, and as they locked up, Michael's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a silent promise that he wasn't walking away. That night, as Ellie slept and the apartment settled into quiet, Sarah sat on the couch, the necklace in her hand, its sapphire glinting like a piece of her past she couldn't outrun. Michael joined her, offering a mug of tea, and for the first time, she felt the urge to tell him everything, but fear held her back. Instead, she met his eyes and said, "Thank you for not pushing me away." He nodded, his gaze steady. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said, and those words, simple and true, felt like the safest place she'd ever known. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly as Sarah and Michael slipped out the back door, the night air sharp against her skin, her heart still racing from the stranger's intrusion. Michael's truck was parked in the alley, its dented frame a familiar anchor in the chaos of her thoughts. He opened the passenger door for her, his movements quick but calm, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the man who'd snapped. "Her photo. We need to get Ellie," he said, his voice low, urgency threaded through it, and Sarah nodded, guilt tightening her chest at the thought of pulling his daughter into her mess. They drove in tense silence, the city's lights blurring past, Sarah's fingers twisting the hem of her borrowed sweatshirt, the sapphire necklace a heavy weight in her pocket. At Mrs. Chen's house, Ellie was curled up on a couch, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her eyes heavy with sleep but brightening when she saw Michael. "Daddy," she chirped, scrambling into his arms, and Sarah's heart ached at the sight. The pure trust in Ellie's hug, a stark contrast to the fear clawing at her. Mrs. Chen, her face lined with quiet understanding, handed Michael a thermos of tea and waved them off with a reassuring nod. "She'd be safe with me if you need more time," she said. But Michael shook his head, his jaw set. "We'll handle this," he said, his voice steady, and Sarah felt a pang of gratitude mixed with dread. In the truck, Ellie dozed in the back seat, her soft snores a fragile reminder of what was at stake. Michael glanced at Sarah, his hands tight on the wheel. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to know what we're dealing with," he said, his tone gentle but firm. Sarah took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "My father, Richard, he's powerful, owns half the real estate in the next city over, expects me to marry someone to seal a deal. I ran because I couldn't be his pawn anymore," she said, the words spilling out like a dam breaking, her voice trembling but resolute. Michael's expression didn't change, but his grip on the wheel softened, and he nodded, absorbing her truth without judgment. "He sent that guy to find you," he said, not a question, and Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I thought I could disappear, but he always finds me," she whispered, and for the first time she felt the weight of her father's shadow, not as a distant threat but as a force closing in. Michael turned onto a quiet road, pulling over under a canopy of trees, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice a steady anchor, "but right now, we need to keep you and Ellie safe." Sarah looked at him, his profile sharp in the dim light, and saw not just a man who'd offered her a couch, but someone who stood between her and the storm without hesitation. They drove to a small motel on the city's edge, its faded sign blinking in the dark, a place Michael knew from his night shifts, where the owner wouldn't ask questions. Inside the cramped room, Sarah sat on the edge of a worn bed, Ellie asleep beside her, while Michael stood by the window, checking the parking lot. "You didn't sign up for this," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, guilt heavy in her chest. Michael turned, his eyes meeting hers, steady and unflinching. "I signed up the moment I saw you under that street lamp," he said, and the words landed like a quiet vow, warming her despite the fear. He sat across from her, his hands clasped, and for a moment, they just breathed, the weight of the night settling around them. Sarah's fingers brushed the necklace in her pocket, and she pulled it out, holding it up, its sapphire glinting like a piece of her past she couldn't outrun. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice soft. "He gave it to me to remind me of my place, but it's just a chain, not a home." Michael reached out, his calloused fingers brushing hers as he took the necklace, studying it before handing it back. "You get to decide what it means now," he said, and Sarah felt a spark of courage, a sense that she could rewrite her story. They stayed up, talking in low voices, Michael sharing stories of Ellie's first steps, his own struggles after her mother left, and Sarah offering fragments of her life, a childhood of gilded cages, a father who loved her but saw her as a transaction. As dawn crept through the curtains, Ellie stirred, mumbling for water, and Sarah fetched it, her movements gentle, maternal in a way that surprised her. Michael watched, his eyes softening, and Sarah realized she was falling for him, not just his kindness, but the way he lived for Ellie, the way he made her feel seen. When they left the motel, Michael drove them back to the city, his plan to keep Sarah out of sight until they could think clearly. But as they passed the diner, a black car idled nearby, its sleek lines out of place in the gritty street. Sarah's breath caught, and Michael's hand found hers, squeezing briefly. "We faced this together," he said. And in that moment, Sarah knew she wasn't just running from her past, she was running towards something worth fighting for. Sarah stood in the marble-floored foyer of her father's penthouse, the city skyline glittering through towering windows, a cold, polished world that felt as distant as a stranger's memory. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the resolve that had carried her here, the sapphire necklace, now a weightless choice in her pocket, rather than a chain. Michael had driven her to the edge of the city, Ellie asleep in the back seat, his quiet encouragement, "You don't have to do this alone, but you can do it," echoing in her mind as she faced the life she'd fled. Her father, Richard, sat at a sleek glass table, his silver hair immaculate, his eyes fixed on a tablet displaying stock prices, barely acknowledging her entrance. "I expected you'd tire of playing runaway," he said, his voice smooth but edged with disdain. Not looking up, Sarah's spine stiffened, her voice steady despite the pulse hammering in her throat. "I didn't come to beg for your world, I came to tell you I'm done with it," she said, stepping closer, her borrowed sneakers silent on the polished floor. Richard's gaze flicked up, sharp and assessing, like she was a deal gone sour. "You've been hiding with a janitor, Sarah, living in a shoebox with his kid. You think that's a life?" he asked, his tone cutting. But Sarah held her ground, her heart anchored by the memory of Ellie's laughter, Michael's steady hand. "It's more of a life than you ever gave me," she said, her words clear, unflinching. "You offered me everything except the right to choose." Richard stood, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the worn jacket Sarah wore, and paced to the window, his back to her. "You're throwing away a legacy for a man who can't afford to keep the lights on," he said, his voice tight, but Sarah saw the faintest crack in his composure, a flicker of something human. "Michael's not just a man, he's a father who shows up for his daughter every day, who taught me what it means to be free, not owned," she said, her voice softening but firm. "I love him, Dad, not because he's perfect, but because he's real." Richard turned, his eyes narrowing, but for the first time, Sarah saw doubt in them, a shadow of the father who'd once read her bedtime stories before wealth consumed him. "Love doesn't pay bills," he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty, and Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding with a truth she'd never spoken aloud. "It's not about money, it's about waking up without feeling like a prisoner, about building something with people who see me, not what I can do for them," she said, her eyes steady. "Michael and Ellie gave me that, and I'm choosing them." The silence stretched, heavy with years of unspoken pain, and Richard's shoulders sagged, just enough to betray a crack in his armor. "You're making a mistake," he said, but his voice was quieter now, almost a plea. Sarah shook her head, a small smile breaking through. "No, I'm making a life," she said, and turned toward the door, her steps lighter, like shedding a weight she'd carried too long. Richard's voice stopped her at the threshold. "If you walk out, you're on your own," he said, but there was no threat in it, only a father's fear of losing his daughter. Sarah looked back, her eyes soft but resolute. "I've been on my own my whole life. I just didn't know what it felt like to be home until now," she said, and walked out, the city's hum swallowing her footsteps. Hours later, she stood on Michael's doorstep, the morning sun painting the cracked paint of his apartment building in warm hues. In her hands, she held a small paper bag with homemade blueberry muffins, their scent mingling with the crisp air. Michael opened the door, his eyes widening, a mix of relief and caution in his expression. "You're back," he said, his voice rough, and Sarah nodded, her heart full. "Not just for a night, for good, if you'll have me," she said, her voice steady, her eyes searching his for any trace of doubt. Michael stepped aside, letting her in, and Ellie's voice called from the living room, "Sarah." The little girl ran to her, wrapping her arms around Sarah's waist, and Sarah knelt, handing her the muffins. "For you, sunshine," she said, her voice catching as Ellie's smile lit up the room. They moved to the kitchen, where Michael was shaping pancakes into clumsy stars, and Sarah joined in, her laughter mixing with Ellie's giggles as they flipped batter onto the counter. Later, at a bustling park fair, their old truck transformed into a makeshift food stall, Sarah flipped pancakes on a portable grill while Michael took orders, his quiet smile a beacon of their shared future. Ellie darted between them, handing out napkins with stickers, her joy infectious. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the crowd, Sarah caught Michael's eye, and he mouthed, "We're enough," his words a promise that needed no wealth, only love. Sarah grinned, her heart full, knowing she'd found a home not in a place, but in the people who chose her as she chose them.